I posted a poll which got a lot of attention and debate a few weeks back. The question is simple: who would do better, Hinata playing football or Isagi playing volleyball? I was expecting it to be fairly close, but the results honestly shocked me. So before I reveal them, I'll give you a moment to think about who you'd vote for whilst I run through their strengths and weaknesses. And funny enough, they're complete opposites. Hinata has been shown to surprise even national level players with his raw athleticism. He might not be big or strong, but his speed, agility and jumping power are all S tier, even among other athletes his age. And one thing I don't think is ever really spoken about is his monstrous stamina. This guy is dashing and sprinting around all game and never really seems to slow down at all. The only time I can recall it ever limiting him was right at the end of the 5-set match with Shiro Torizawa, by which point I played close to 240 points. Don't let his heightened, light-hearted attitude fool you. This guy is an absolute monster physically. However, he still struggles a lot technically, even at his own sport, and his ability to read the game was seriously lacking for a lot of Haikyuu, believing him relying solely on instinct and Kageyama. Although to be fair to him, by the end of the series, this has drastically improved. Isagi, on the other hand, demonstrates an inhuman ability to read the game and predict his opponents, which allows him to be at least one step ahead of everyone else at all times. He's able to make split-second decisions which have allowed him to react even to Bachira's erratic awakening at the end of the first season. And these aren't just blind guesses, they're very logical decisions which he's able to calculate extremely fast. However, he's the complete opposite of Hinata in terms of his physicality. When you put him up against the other characters in this show, he's definitely at the bottom end of the rankings in terms of physical attributes. I mean, he's even worse than this guy, whose name I honestly don't even remember at this point. However, much like Hinata, he's been working on his weaknesses and making good progress. So the two really are complete opposites. But a big question is, if they swapped sports, who would fare better? 78% of you said Isagi. Now, there's a bit of an issue with this poll in that there's no time frame, so I'm going to split this into two parts, when they first start playing and further down the line. Also, because the Haikyuu manga is finished and Blue Lock isn't, comparing the mangas wouldn't be fair. So this will be anime only, which also keeps it spoiler free. So let's go ahead and throw Hinata into his first football match to see how he does. And honestly, I think he does alright, you know? His speed and agility alone is going to make him a real nightmare for the opposing defenders. And as I mentioned earlier, this man's stamina is not something to be taken lightly. He's already going to be one of the fastest on the pitch, and as everyone else gets tired, they're really going to struggle to keep up with his zigzagging dashes. Now, of course, there's no guarantee he'll be the best at any of those factors I just mentioned. Realistically, Chuguya is just as fast, Zenitsu just as agile, and Tokimitsu has just as much stamina. However, Hinata will definitely be the upper end of the rankings of all three in every match he's in. Furthermore, he does actually score a few points with his foot in Haikyuu, you know, so he likely has some very basic level of skill with his feet. It's not going to be anything crazy, emphasis on very basic, but if he's able to get past everyone with his speed, there's a reasonable chance he scores from it. Of course, he's going to be one of the physically weakest players on the pitch, he's going to lack any real game sense, and his technique will definitely hold him back plenty. Furthermore, an over-reliance on physical attributes means when he does go up against players that haven't been in those aspects, he's going to struggle. And his players definitely do exist. I mentioned Tokimitsu's stamina earlier, but he definitely at least matches Hinata's speed and agility. And Loki's on a whole other level to Hinata. If he's on the other team, Hinata is going to be completely shut out the game. Or will he? We've not mentioned his greatest strength yet, his jumping power. We know Hinata's jumps are very impressive for his size, with his vertical being just 1.5 inches below Kageyama, despite Kageyama being 7 inches taller than him. But whilst it's just impressive in volleyball, in football, there's actually a major significance to this. This is quite awkward to explain over screen, but hopefully what I'm about to say makes sense. You see, Hinata, being shorter than Kageyama, also has shorter arms than him. The reason why this is significant is best shown in this clip of Hinata and Ushiwaka. Their verticals are about the same, but Ushiwaka being taller has the advantage of longer arms. If you look at their heads, Hinata's is higher. Now obviously in football you're not allowed to use your arms, so that arm disadvantage of Hinata no longer exists. He's able to get his head higher than even other volleyball players taller than him, focus a lot on their vertical jump. In football, he's definitely going to be able to get above most other players in the air for corners, crosses, etc. If you're still not convinced, here's how he stacks up against the rest of his team. He's above everyone except for 3 players. Kageyama, who we've already mentioned, is 7 inches taller. Tsukishima has him beat by 1 centimeter, but is 10 inches taller than him. And Asahi, who ties with him, is almost 9 inches taller than him. Hinata beats the rest of the team. And again, if his little arms can reach the same height as the 6'2" Tsukishima, his head is definitely higher. I'm not saying he's going to be jumping above every single player in the world. There are some giant footballers who likely have a solid vertical jump of their own, but I do think there's a very good chance whoever's defending against him simply can't jump as high as him. Remember, football players generally don't work on their vertical jump as much as volleyball players do, because it's just not as big of a part of the sport. And the few that can match Hinata's jump are generally going to be these 6'5" giants, a lot of which would struggle to match his agility in order to actually mark him properly. Once again, I know these players do exist, but they're very rare. I don't think anyone in Blue Lock has him beaten both jumping power and speed. Haikyuu is probably the only player who can match his jumping, and I don't think he's quicker than Hinata at all. Although he's not going to be scoring any hat tricks, I do think Hinata is going to find a good number of chances. There'll be at least a few times where his speed, stamina, and jumping power will open doors for him or his teammates. But how does he compare to Isagi, a man who's shot up the ranks of Blue Lock to become one of its top contenders? Well, as mentioned, Isagi's main weapons are his spatial awareness, his predictions, and his direct shot, which I always thought was called a volley, but anyway. I'm actually going to come back to that though. But for now, let's look at his brain and his spatial awareness. Now, a volleyball court is way smaller than a football pitch and has way fewer players on it. So it's going to be extremely easy for him to keep track of everyone at all times. And he'll likely be fine doing so even in his first match. However, that's just half the battle. When it comes to using this information, there's an obvious issue here. Isagi's predictions aren't just based on everyone's current locations. They're also based on experience. Remember, this is a man who's been obsessed with football since birth, who's played and watched thousands of matches, and in doing so built an extensive database of strategies and plays that people make. For instance, his victory over Nico was based on experience. He'd been in that situation before, so was able to read Nico's moves. When he surpassed Rin by predicting Batra's awakening, it was based both on his experience of Batra, but also recognizing that Rin was in the perfect position to pass to. Whilst it was incredibly impressive how quickly he calculated how to respond to it, volleyball is a whole other sport, and it's going to take him a while to build up to that before he can accurately make any predictions. I know Isagi learns very quickly, but trying to outpredict players who are way more experienced than you in your first few games is going to be extremely challenging. At the very least, it's not going to be something that he can consistently do, especially when you consider just how quickly he has to make these predictions in order for them to be effective. But I'm not writing him off just yet for 2 main reasons. Firstly, Isagi is actually capable of using the fact that he's disadvantaged to his advantage, as he proved against Rin. However, this was dependent on him having a secret weapon Rin wasn't aware of, namely his back heel shot. Without that, it likely wouldn't have worked as well as it did. But secondly, and much more significantly, there's the fact that it doesn't always have to be these super complex predictions to win. For instance, he set up Chiguri's goal just by using his spatial awareness to see that he was running really fast and just passing to him. There'll be plenty of situations like that in volleyball too. You know, if he can spot that someone like Tanaka is free and no enemy block is near him, all he has to do is send the ball his way. And we know he'll be good at spotting these chances from everything we've seen him do in Blue Lock. So whilst I do think he's initially not going to be able to use it to anywhere near the level he can in football, or the other setters he'd be up against, he definitely will get his team some points with that big brain of his. But there's another dimension to all of this, and that's his physical attribute. And unfortunately, Isagi is going to be near the bottom of the pack physically. In particular, jumping power is very important, and with his underwhelming height and jumps even for a football player, Isagi is going to be way below average in volleyball. He's going to struggle to block and spike effectively. And I think this is why some people had him pinned as a libero rather than a setter, which does get around his height disadvantage whilst still letting him use his brain. But I think even there, he's still going to lack the agility to keep up. So I don't think there's too much more to say on this, to be honest. You know, I can understand why some people disagree with what I said about his brain earlier, but I think it's quite objective that Isagi will be behind in the physical side of things. He's already quite behind in his own sport, and whilst I know he's been working on some aspects of that, I don't think he's improved his vertical jump at all, really. Certainly not to the point where he could reach the same height as some of the players he'd be up against. Now, finally we have his direct shot, which it's just not going to work. You know, I know Hinata did score a point or two with his foot, so maybe he can catch people by surprise and score 1 or 2 points with this, but it's so unreliable. You know, this is not going to be something he can actually use consistently. So all in all, even though I'm aware a lot of people watching this are going to disagree, I think on day one, Hinata absolutely takes this. They're both going to be behind everyone else on skill and technique, but Hinata's going to be near the top physically on multiple attributes, whereas Isagi will definitely be behind. In terms of game sense, Hinata is going to be behind, but Isagi, whilst still quite effective, is just not going to be the same monster he is in football. Simply put, I think Hinata's strengths carry over a lot more to football than Isagi's do to volleyball. Again, I know a lot of you watching are going to disagree, which is fair enough, but hopefully you can see the case I'm making that. In the early stages of their new careers, Hinata is able to use his strengths to pretty much 100% from day one, whereas Isagi's missing quite a big piece of the puzzle here and isn't going to have that same level of immediate carryover. But what about the long run? Now, this is where it gets interesting. I'll assume that they both develop their general technique for their new sports at a roughly equal rate, but I will come back to that assumption. Anyway, let's start off Hinata again. Towards the end of his series, he does start to improve his ability to read the game a lot. And so he would of course do the same with football too. Combining this with his top-notch athleticism, he's going to be able to find even more chances for himself, and he's going to be able to better convert on them due to improving his technique. I also imagine he'll have likely worked on his sprinting a lot to help with the above, and if he really focuses on getting his physical attributes up, he could honestly end up with low-key tier speed on top of a near unmatchable jump. And yeah, that's Hinata. There's not really going to be anything magical about it, he's just going to slowly get better at everything. And I know that's kind of what happens in Haikyuu, and it does over the course of the story, turning from a very inconsistent player into an undeniable terror. There doesn't need to be anything crazy to it. Hinata could definitely become a pretty solid football player with his top-notch athleticism. But how does that compare to Isagi? Isagi's long-term career is for sure the most interesting part of this whole debate. Alongside developing his setting technique, I imagine Isagi would also focus on developing his vertical jumps, as this would have really held him back a lot initially. But all the while he'll be developing something much more significant. As his experience grows and he plays in more and more matches, he's eventually going to reach the point where he can really use his brainstorm to make some high-level predictions to get his spikers past the opposing blockers. He's definitely going to be dropping some very sneaky setups too. And again, remember, this guy had no problem processing 22 players on a much bigger field. With 6 players on a smaller pitch, he's going to have no problems whatsoever. Now, of course, his high-level spatial awareness arguably isn't as useful for that exact reason. Because it's so much easier, far more players will have the ability to do this. And so generally, his opponents are going to be able to see the same things he sees. But keeping track of everyone's position is just half of his talent. The other half is his godlike quick decisions and predictions, which I honestly think, given enough time and volleyball experience, it would eventually be on par with even someone like Kageyama. Of course, his technique wouldn't ever catch up to Kageyama's level, as he's got a decade's head start on him, and is also just a natural at volleyball. Isagi would be more like Kenma, with a very average technique and physicality, but able to read his opponents very well to create chances for his team. Except I would argue with an even better brain than Kenma, although I do think that will take him a little while. So both are going to develop their strengths even further. Both are going to work on their weaknesses. But there's 2 deciding factors here. Firstly, I think Isagi just learns faster than Hinata. Looking at the stories, Hinata has always developed extremely quickly, but every single game, Isagi picks up new tricks, new strategies, new knowledge. Provided that the match is intense enough to really push him, he'll walk in as one player and walk out a whole new one. At the start, I assumed their technique would develop at a roughly equal rate, but realistically, whilst Hinata has been shown to be able to pick up techniques from others very quickly, for instance his new jump after watching Hoshiumi, I do think Isagi learns that extra bit faster. And so I reckon Isagi is going to develop his technique quicker than Hinata will. Secondly, Hinata is eventually going to hit a point where his physical specs just won't really improve at all. Or at the very least, progress will be absolutely minimal because it'd be so close to his natural limit. With anything physical, or anything at all really, the better you get at something, the slower progress is. Whereas, based on what we've seen from Isagi, I really don't think his brain is ever going to hit a limit like that. At the very least, I think it's fair to say that pretty much forever, Isagi will be improving his game sense faster than Hinata is able to improve his physicality. Although Hinata has a better starting point, the gap between Hinata's athleticism and Isagi's brain is going to get closer and closer with time. And I think it would be fair to say the potential for both their strengths is probably roughly equal. I'm sure there'll be plenty of debate on that, but I would put it roughly equal. Of course, we haven't covered their weaknesses, namely Hinata's game sense or Isagi's physicality, but I don't see a clear winner on which of these improves faster, to be honest. I definitely don't think there's enough in this to offset any of what we've just said. And so, all in all, it may take a while, but someday, at some point, I think this is what we're going to end up with. And so, in the long run, I agree with the voters. I do in fact think Isagi takes this, purely on account of his technique developing faster. If you're new here and you're a fan of either of these shows, I've got plenty of videos on both. Do let me know what you thought of this video. I do actually read every comment I get, so if you disagreed with any of it, let me know. I'm not an expert on either of these two sports, so if anyone is, I'd love to hear what they think. Otherwise, thanks for watching, bro. Hopefully see you again soon.